One of the quirkiest and yet fondly remembered, as well as the most critically heralded of Image's earliest releases, the Max has unfortunately proven as much of a burden to Sam Kieth as a blessing in many ways. In fact, if you were to read what Sam Kieth has to say about the series, you'd probably run screaming in the other direction. From the moment the series started with great prosperity and somewhat undesired notoriety, also came difficult decisions and long, thankless hours of work. Caught in a dream that would soon become a waking nightmare for the soft-spoken artist, Sam Kieth was on the verge of becoming an icon in modern comics and losing it all in the blink of an eye. As disenfranchised at one point with the Max as he may have ever possibly been interested in the character, after years of toiling away on other people's creations, what spurred the aspiring young artist, who by all rights was just starting to really come into his own on his incredibly successful Marvel Comics Presents cover run, which is still heralded as one of the high watermarks of the 90s comic art movement, to completely sever ties with that company and get in bed with their competition overnight. And why does Sam Kieth seem to dislike the Max so much? Join me tonight as we continue our multi-part examination of Kieth's career and a little tasty tidbit of tawdry industry trivia and another one of comics' greatest stories never told: How the Max Broke Sam Kieth Part 2. The Nightmare of Success. Remember, if you enjoy these videos, do me a favor and hit that like button. Think about getting in the comments section below and letting me know. And if you really enjoy what you see, make sure you hug smash that subscribe button. If you feel like you're in a position to help the channel grow, think about using the links in the description below to sign up for my Patreon page, make a donation via Ko-Fi, pick up a shirt, or use the join button to sign up for membership right here on YouTube. But now, let's get into it. It took Sam Kieth an excruciating amount of time to break into the industry, from humble beginnings on parody work for famed publisher Don Chen, where he finally got his break on penciling on the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles parody book Radioactive Black Belt Hamsters, to the devastating experiences working on the initial issues of what would become perhaps the most well-received ongoing series in the latter half of the decade, Sandman, with famed author Neil Gaiman. Sam Kieth had finally managed to work his way up to doing interiors for a Wolverine story set to appear in Marvel Comics Presents. If Kieth's increasing notoriety from Sandman weren't enough, the Wolverine story Blood Hungry was going to be hot on the heels of the absolutely jaw-dropping Barry Windsor Smith Weapon X story and feature prominent Hulk scribe Peter David. Originally, Marvel had planned to bring the big guns for the story and hire superstar Todd McFarlane. McFarlane ended up not doing the story for a few reasons though, and Sam Kieth was given Blood Hungry instead. While only 8 pages a month, Blood Hungry was still a massive struggle for the young artist, who was at the time tackling at least one, if not 2 covers for Marvel Comics Presents every month, on top of a bunch of Bat Family covers and other stuff, including work for Don Chen's parody press like the absolutely immortal Pummeler cover or Pat Mills' Nemesis the Warlock on a monthly basis. I talked about this a lot more in detail in part 1, but Sam Kieth was really burning the candle at both ends, even before he ended up doing Blood Hungry. Despite his popularity with fans after the Blood Hungry series wrapped up, Marvel stopped offering him interiors. Sam Kieth had lost out to Dale Keown for work on the Hulk title, which I think was basically the only ongoing title that Marvel thought he would really fit on. At the time, Dale Keown was just hitting his stride and was immensely popular on the title, with no signs that Dale Keown would be leaving the Hulk anytime soon. Even though Sam Kieth was regularly producing 2 covers a month for Marvel Comics Presents, as well as a bevy of other work at the time, Sam Kieth wasn't really sure what his future with Marvel was going to be, and what he was managing to get was far from enough to put food on the table, apparently. In Sam Keith's mind, the key to making it was doing interiors, and after Blood Hungry, Sam Keith has said he felt like he was basically being blacklisted from doing interior work for Marvel. While his style was super popular with those of us that got into it, Sam Keith constantly talks about how there was a good deal of controversy, especially among readers, about the way he specifically drew feet. Try as he might, Sam Keith constantly found himself the odd man out and always felt weird at Marvel. By the end of 1992, Sam Keith, who always has spoken highly of his editor on Marvel Comics Presents, Terry Kavanagh, and the other people he worked with at Marvel as well, was starting to get really frustrated he couldn't get interior work from the company. I think this mounting displeasure was definitely due to money, but also the mindset that Keith had at the time. For years in interviews, Sam Keith spoke one way about how you succeeded in the comic industry, and that was on characters' shoulders. Sam Keith wasn't alone, and the general mindset up until Image Comics blew up was that you basically came up in the independent circuit. You put in your time, and eventually you moved to DC, or preferably Marvel, and worked on one of their top-tier books. Once you'd worked your way up the ladder and managed to work on one of the big books like Batman or Spider-Man, that's when you knew you'd made it. Sam Keith seemingly wanted nothing more than this for years. He never appeared to be inordinately interested in creating his own original characters, and certainly not in making the jump from artist to writer like so many people were doing at the time. Following the conclusion of Wolverine Blood Hungry, and during his onslaught of Marvel Comics Presents covers, Sam Keith realized that this was never going to happen for him, at least not in his estimation. Marvel was never going to let the quote weird feet guy draw Spider-Man or Doctor Strange. They wouldn't even put him on the one book where it felt like he kind of belonged because Dale Keown had beat him out for it. This knowledge of interiors being just out of reach must have been infuriatingly difficult for Sam Keith, given his quiet and fairly demure nature. He wasn't going to be the guy busting down your door talking about how you should hire him or why he was better than the other guys. Sam Keith isn't even good at singing his own praises if you ask him about it directly. He's too honest for his own good sometimes, and he's certainly not the kind of braggadocious individual that goes around boasting and bragging. In a lot of ways, I think that's one of the only ways you succeeded at Marvel during this period of larger-than-life sales figures and personalities to match. While Sam Keith has always said his Marvel Comics Presents editor Terry Kavanagh really had his back, in interviews, Keith seems to have been crawling the walls, wanting to work on something other than covers. He took it as something of an insult that Marvel would hire him to do covers, but they wouldn't dare stick him on interiors after Blood Hungry. He also made it clear in a 2007 interview that the work and pay for Marvel was so inconsequential, as well as unsatisfying. Moving to Image wasn't a difficult decision to make or even really a big deal. He was making so little money working on comics at the time, his wife was still basically paying the bills. He didn't feel like he was going anywhere at Marvel, and after his experiences on Manhunter and especially Sandman, Sam Keith was not going back to DC at this point. So when the phone rang one day and Jim Lee uttered 7 simple words that would change his entire life forever, "Do you want to do 8 pages?" Sam Keith did not hesitate. He was all in. Sam Keith and Jim Lee have always seemed to be strange bedfellows to me, and it actually took a decent deal of digging to figure out how they'd actually met. According to Sam Keith, he'd called up Jim Lee pretty much out of the blue at one point to ask him what he was getting paid for doing his interior work at Marvel. This is how Sam Keith recalls their first meeting. Jim Lee, on the other hand, like basically everyone else who knew Sam Keith from this early period in his career, remembers meeting him at conventions before that conversation ever took place. Lee recalled having a few subsequent conversations with him after meeting at a few conventions, and I'm guessing one of these happened to be the aforementioned discussion about page rates that Sam Keith remembers. And in case you're wondering, Lee explained it was more about royalties and other deals than it was page rates to Keith during that conversation, which will come into play. I think his willingness to talk to Sam Keith and openness about the industry played a big part in the way Sam Keith looked at Jim Lee. While Lee is a well-respected businessman and was an up up-and-coming entrepreneur at the time, much of his legacy gets kind of lost in the shuffle, in my opinion, especially when it comes to his contributions to expanding and developing Image Comics into what we think of as the company today, 30 years later. When I interviewed Jim Valentino, one of the most interesting things he talked about was Jim Lee's interest in bringing, quote, alternative artists to Image and expanding what the company was associated with and known for. While I'd never thought of it at the time, Jim Lee was the first person successful in recruiting non-founding members to join Image. In fact, it turns out after a lot of research, Jim Lee was basically single-handedly responsible for the second wave of Image creators and books. These new recruits included Larry Stroman, Dale Keown, and Sam Kieth, who would all launch titles for Image in 1993. Jim Lee's soft sell approach was probably essential to getting Sam Kieth to agree to join Image, but the fact Sam Kieth saw no future at Marvel and the promise of only having to do 8 pages a month probably didn't hurt either. Rob Liefeld's dad was a preacher, and he has been described as a speed freak who stuck his finger in an electrical socket and then he gets excited. In short, he was basically bouncing off the walls and tended to be a lot to handle. Todd McFarlane, while certainly not as energetic as Rob Liefeld, had a tendency to be pretty intense and aggressive with his approach and came off as the real hellfire and brimstone type, especially at the time. Jim Lee in juxtaposition has always appeared to be a fairly even-keeled, well-put-together guy. Without Jim Lee to really start the ball rolling, recruiting outside talent apart from the founding fathers at Image in only a matter of months, the eventual expansion of the company into what we think of it as today would have played out vastly differently. His calm demeanor and offer of what basically amounted to complete artistic freedom sound like they definitely played an integral part in recruiting the second wave of Image creators too. He instantly knew what to tell people and instinctively how to get them to come on board. Expanding the horizons of the company like this may have come from a fairly monetarily motivated place, but Jim Lee's decision to introduce alternative talent and art styles that were definitely not the norm on the stands was something of a gamble. While it might have come with some risks, the gambit certainly paid off, and this second wave of Image books would become intrinsically linked to Image's lasting legacy and play a big part in shaping the face of the company. While Sam Kieth has jokingly referred to himself as lazy as the reason that he didn't do very many interiors, the reasons were actually numerous. Firstly, anyone who's seen his work, especially from this period, it should be unsurprising to discover Sam Kieth himself did not think he would be able to do 20 plus pages a month and keep up the same level of quality. Sam Kieth's work was some of the most intricate and detailed work you're likely to ever see in comics, with many of his panels and interiors rivaling and in many cases exceeding the quality of the highest quality and most prominent cover artists. And if you want to know more about that, check out the link in the description below about Sam Kieth's work for Marvel on their Nightmare on Elm Street title. Likewise, the abuse Sam Kieth had faced while on Sandman at the hands of Karen Berger on the initial issue and during the subsequent disagreements on Sandman left a rather lasting impact on Sam Kieth. I think in a lot of ways, he was pretty conflicted. He did want to do interiors, but he never wanted to face that level of rejection and humiliation ever again. Berger and his experiences on the title had made Sam Kieth question who he even was as an artist and compromise his artistic integrity. This is something that he would never let happen again. Sam Kieth didn't want to be known as the inker on Mage. He didn't want to be known as the Marvel Comics Presents cover guy. Sam Kieth dreamed of a project he could pour his heart and soul into, a book where he could really be himself and let his art run wild for the first time, but he was afraid of having to crank out 20 pages a month of that kind of excruciatingly detailed art. And it's no wonder. That is a daunting task. Every time Sam Kieth did an illustration, it impossibly seemed more detailed and more intricate than the last. Sam Kieth was never pleased, though. He toyed with every aspect of his artwork he could think of, pushing them in new and innovative directions. Even his interior panel construction and page layouts were in a constant state of evolution and flux for years. Sam Kieth was pushing the limits of what people thought was possible with comic book art in a lot of ways, but he couldn't pay the bills. People were only interested in Sam Kieth doing covers, and that wasn't cutting it, no matter how many of them he did. Young, talented, and most importantly, hungry. When Jim Lee, one of the biggest names in comics, came along and offered to let him do 8 pages a month of whatever he wanted in a book, with not just himself, but industry rock star Rob Liefeld as well, it was an opportunity Sam Kieth could not pass up. Interestingly, however, it seems this agreement came with its own type of baggage for Sam Kieth. Looking back, you would kind of think the pressure was on. Sam Kieth was going to be putting stuff next to 2 of the biggest names in the industry and 2 of the most popular artists ever at the height of their popularity. Both of these guys had literally just broken world records for comic book sales. You would think this would be a daunting prospect for Sam Kieth, and in some ways it was, but according to interviews, the opposite was also kind of true. In many respects, Sam Kieth apparently felt like whatever he did was going to be successful. He was going to be in a book with Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld, and people were going to buy it and like it, or at least say they liked it because of those guys. He could have just put whatever he wanted in the pages of Darker Image, and it would have sold just because it was early Image next to 2 of the most popular artists in the industry. While kind of defeatist, this might still sound like a good thing to a lot of people. I mean, even if you do crap work, you're going to get paid like it was gold. Sam Kieth didn't want that though. He wanted to pour his heart and soul into a book, and he wanted people to like it for him and his work, not because it was a story about an existing popular character like Wolverine, or because he was next to Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld, but he couldn't say no to the proposition. He was not stupid and knew it could be the big opportunity he'd been waiting his entire life for. Unfortunately, Sam Kieth has always felt like an industry outsider, even at Image, and this lent a kind of feeling of senselessness to his work for Darker Image in a lot of ways. At one point, Sam Kieth said he felt lucky to, quote, stand by the amplifiers in reference to the Image founding fathers, and specifically the other artists in Darker Image. While this is arguably true, for Sam Kieth it apparently goes much deeper. Kieth actually says he was jealous of a few different people in interviews. For Kieth, it boiled down to people who rode trends and people who created trends. For Sam Kieth, unless you were the person who really kicked off a sales monster out of nowhere, someone like Alan Moore and his work on Watchmen, Frank Miller on The Dark Knight Returns, or even Jim Lee on X-Men, you didn't have a leg to stand on. You were just riding someone else's success. This meant that no matter what he did, Sam Kieth can't really enjoy his accomplishments from this era. He didn't leave Marvel to found Image, he was in the second wave. He wasn't one of the guys breaking world records for selling most comics. He apparently didn't even feel like a very good artist comparatively. False modesty aside, Kieth has always known he can draw, so this felt strange to me in a lot of ways when I heard him say that. When I discovered an interesting quote where Kieth was asked about his hyper-detailed style from this period, things started to fall into place though. Sam Kieth's answer provides an astounding insight into just why Kieth has continually distanced himself from this earlier style, and answers a lot of questions as to why he repeatedly makes mention of, quote, being a different person when he drew the Max, as well as his being jealous of other Image artists. In the interview, Sam Kieth said that of all the recognizable aspects which people associate with this period of his work with and think are so unique and original, are all actually directly swiped from other popular artists' style. Despite his obvious love of illustrators like Bernie Wrightson and Frank Frazetta, the reason his characters are so large is because of the way that, in Sam Kieth's words, Rob Liefeld's characters were all, quote, puffed up with air. The distinctive noodling, as it's come to be called, those tatters that were hanging off of shredded costumes and those endless lines and everything, that was Sam Kieth doing Todd McFarlane's spaghetti webbing. He would continue on to say that while he attempted to take parts and pieces from other hot artists' style at the time, he continually failed in even doing that. In his words, it always just ended up, quote, looking like his stuff anyway. This had to be frustrating for Sam Kieth as he's gotten further and further into his decades-long career. Especially, these early illustrations and examples are often the ones he's most associated with, and the fundamental aspects of their entire style were taken from places that were not his own. An interesting aside here about this, though, Kieth refers to his work in a lot of ways, but the one term that continuously pops up is weird. He never refers to Rob Liefeld's stuff or Todd McFarlane's stuff as weird. Regardless, I think this is a lot of the reason that Sam Kieth has moved so far away from this initial style. He can't stand to look at it. It feels like him trying to not just be someone else, but directly trying to copy other people's style and not succeeding at that, in his opinion. Because of this, it seems to be a real sore spot when people talk to Sam Kieth about this part of his career. And one of the rare pieces where Sam Kieth goes into some real depth about the Maxx, aside from articles published contemporaneously, for the 2007 Tomorrow's Publishing Image The Road to Independence, Sam Kieth gets almost argumentative with the interviewer and author Brian Corey. Corey repeatedly tries to compliment Sam Kieth and his work from this period and is rebuffed at every turn. Corey, who I don't think knew what was really going on, actually tries to argue with Sam Kieth about it. Eventually, Kieth lays it out that the Maxx would have been popular no matter what because of Rob Liefeld and Jim Lee. Kieth says he's not actually super proud of taking credit for something he thinks Lee and Liefeld really deserve most of the praise for. With no idea what he's walked into, Corey tries to argue that the Maxx wouldn't have lasted past the first few issues if people weren't interested, at which point Sam Kieth gets downright defensive. His responses to Corey's praise of his work are very clear and I think representative of what Sam Kieth sees when he looks at that work. He says he's not proud of a lot of the stories from that series, going on to refer to many of the issues as, quote, ratty. He talks about one of the reasons people remember it so fondly being is because they were all recalling it incorrectly. Sam Kieth argues that while there are some decent parts to it, the Maxx gets unfairly lumped together just because it all came out under one title around the same time. He also says the art was often rushed. He was unhappy with a lot of his own work on the series, and by the end, he had absolutely no idea what was happening, and he can't stand to look at it. Upon first reading the interview, it struck me as much more aggressive than any other I had ever read with the usually reserved artist. I think the reason for this is the fact that Brian Corey keeps trying to push praise about the series. And when it comes down to it, Sam Kieth really isn't proud of his work on the Maxx in a lot of ways, at least not as a whole. He might see bits and pieces he likes, but the Maxx was a rushed process he got drug into in a lot of ways, and his belief that his style is somehow stolen from other people already having tainted that work, and then being in the same book with people he saw as legitimate superstars, people he never felt like he was in the same weight class with, and actually sold the book, not him, on his weird work, and then having to take any compliments or acknowledge any accolades about whatever he might have actually accomplished there, it seems to be almost more than Sam Kieth can take. As strange as it may sound, Sam Kieth gets defensive when faced with the repeated compliments from Corey. This is apparently one of the major faux pas when talking to Sam Kieth, though. While Corey complimenting his Maxx work so profusely is, I think, what certainly seems to have riled Kieth up in this particular case, what's interesting is this didn't start with the Maxx. It appears that complimenting Sam Kieth has always been a pretty big no-no. After years of reading and talking to people who know him, it honestly appears Sam Kieth isn't able to take a compliment like you or I perhaps would. For me, at least, compliments reinforce the fact people are enjoying what I'm doing, and if nothing else, they give me a nice, warm, fuzzy feeling for a few minutes, like what I do actually matters, and I might not be as awfully terrible at doing this as I think. This does not appear to be the case for Sam Kieth. For whatever reason, he always sees his successes reflected back in an ugly, distorted fashion. There is a lot of people who toss around the idea of imposter syndrome after the first episode, and having done a bunch of reading about it afterwards, I wouldn't necessarily argue with this armchair psychological assessment, because he perhaps sees his accomplishments marred by factors which you or I would chalk up to as circumstance or luck, but in Keith's mind are the bedrock upon which he undermines his own successes. There's always someone else to heap the adoration or the successes on. He's more than happy to take the critiques, but seeing the amazing and fantastic things he's managed to accomplish in the medium appears to be sadly out of Sam Keith's grasp for reasons I don't think anyone other than he will ever be fully aware of. While the 2007 interview, perhaps better than any other I've ever read, reinforces this fact quite well, in the introduction to I-B4E, a collection of Keith's independent work that was collected and released by Fantagraphics in August of 1991, William Messner Loebs makes it abundantly clear this has always been the case, ending his introduction with these prophetic words. Quote, "When you see Sam at a convention, go up, get your book signed, shake his hand. Buy a sketch, but don't tell him he's good. He'll only give you an argument." Messner Loebs talked more about this in my interview with him about the Maxx, and if you want to check that out, there will be links to that in the description below. Despite what the book would come to represent for Sam Keith, when Jim Lee initially made the offer, it was still for the planned anthology series and was only going to be 8 pages a month. While it appears that from the very beginning there were plans to do a Wizard 1/2 issue of the Maxx as well as a miniseries if the character proved to be successful and he wanted to do it, but Sam Keith had no intention of doing an ongoing monthly title when he started work on Darker Image. While Jim Lee's patented soft sell approach might have been what got him to sign up with Image, the promise of only having to provide 8 pages a month also seems to have been pretty critical in my opinion. After his decision to move to Image, things started moving fast though. He didn't necessarily have a wonderful game plan going into the series, and Keith knew he was going to need some serious help to pull it all off, especially with the writing. While he wasn't necessarily interested in writing himself prior to the Maxx, Sam Keith had a small list of people he thought were essential to the series going in. With little more than a concept in mind and a due date in hand, Sam Keith quickly set to work assembling his dream team for the series. While the transition from Marvel to Image was a quick one, and according to many interviews, did not afford Sam Keith the kind of time he would have liked to get his idea, concept, and story as well thought out and planned for publication as he would have liked, he did have a very clear idea of who he wanted for the series from the moment he started though. First was inker Jim Sinclair. While Jim Sinclair probably isn't a household name by any stretch, other than Sam Keith, he's probably actually had a longer involvement with the series than anyone else ever though. Jim Sinclair was present from the very first story in Darker Image to the 35th issue of the Maxx series, The Friends of Maxx, and everything in between. He is more than anyone else one of the major factors that contributed to making the Maxx such a phenomenal series art-wise. His particular finishes, and especially his background and inking work on the Maxx, are absolutely synonymous with the style that most people associate with the book. Attesting to his importance and involvement in the series, Jim Sinclair was the only person from the original Maxx series that Sam Keith called up when re-releasing the series nearly 20 years later in the remastered Maximized editions, but don't worry, we'll get to all of that in good time. As far as the original series goes, a lot of the hidden messages and intricate details from the backgrounds in the initial issues of the Maxx, which I had long thought were Sam Keith, were in fact done by Jim Sinclair. Sometimes Sam Keith would even accentuate these jokes though, adding to them as the two artists bounce work back and forth. In the opening issue, if you look on the wall of the Maxx's cell when he's arrested, there's everything from messages about Image Comics and Spawn to Kelly Jones' name, to lines of dialogue from Sandman, and even a phone number saying to call Sam. Apparently, when Sam Keith saw the hokey 555 Hollywood prefix that Jim Sinclair had used, he thought it would be funnier to change it to 585 though. This resulted in more than a few readers calling a random phone number from this wall of a comic book only to be greeted by a message that the number had been disconnected. This resulted in several people writing into the series to complain, actually asking what was up with the phony number in the letter section. It might seem weird I'm bringing this up, but it proved fans were locked in for the ride from day one with the Maxx. It wasn't Jim Lee or Rob Liefeld or even Darker Image. It was the unique mixture of absolute perfection you saw on a lot of these Maxx stories. It's really interesting to see just how much of these tiny details people actually discovered and how quickly they found them as they got brought up in the letter section, like the next issue. This is before everything was easily accessible on the internet, so that means people were actually staring at these pictures so long and getting out magnifiers and stuff to read hidden messages and call random phone numbers from the wall of a comic book starting in the first issue. Well, a lot of fans loved this stuff, and I think most of us chalked it up to Sam Kieth. Nothing could be further from the truth. Jim Sinclair, who also had a peculiarity for tiny details and obsessing over things like Sam Kieth, was apparently obsessed with two things: adding hearts to any and every mug that he could possibly find, and hiding 8 balls in every conceivable way that he could when inking. I only know this because Sam Kieth, who usually doesn't talk about stuff like this, actually complained about the hearts and mugs in a response to a letter early on in the series, and then 20 years later, in 2009, he went off about it on a DVD commentary track to an episode of the cartoon. A crew member, Seth Kearsley, laughingly points out, quote, "There's another 8 ball in there. Lots of 8 balls hidden all over the place," to which Sam Kieth responds, quote, "Jim Sinclair would stick 8 balls in there and I'd get pissed off. I'd say, stop doing that. And he'd say, oh yeah, it's my thing. And it's in the friggin' cartoon now. I hope you're happy, Jim. I had no control over it, man." Unfortunately, there's not an inordinate amount out there about Jim Sinclair prior to his work on, or in fact, about his work on the Maxx even. I did manage to get a hold of him, but unfortunately we could just never get our schedules to mesh, and I never got a chance to do an interview with him or ask him any real questions. He was a super friendly guy though, and I do know he did a good deal of Marvel work in the late 80s, mostly on Air Raiders throughout 1988, and sporadic books from a few other independent publishers like Innovation, Cirrus, and Eclipse. I don't know how Sam Kieth and Jim Sinclair initially got hooked up, or even when they met. What I do know is that Jim Sinclair wasn't just an inker, but a finisher and responsible for a great deal of the style and aesthetic on the interiors that most people associate with the Maxx to this day. There are entire panels done by Jim Sinclair, even in the first half dozen issues, and their clashes about hearts and 8 balls aside, Jim Sinclair seems to be perhaps the one person that Sam Kieth actually felt comfortable with taking the artistic reins on the Maxx to any real extent aside from himself. Given how closely the two worked, I was really bummed out that I never got a chance to properly interview or to even talk to Jim about his work on the art for the Maxx. Sadly, there's just painfully little out there about Jim Sinclair or any of the creative team from the Maxx. Luckily, I did have the opportunity to sit down and have a 4-hour conversation with the other major force responsible for helping bring Sam Kieth's surrealistic vision to life, and the other half of Sam Kieth's dream team for the book, writer extraordinaire William Messner Loebs. Again, links to that interview in the description below if you want to check that out when you're done here. William Messner Loebs' role would shift and change throughout the length of the title. He's probably the single most important addition to the Maxx outside of Sam Kieth himself, in my opinion, though. In fact, when asked in interviews years prior during his Marvel Comics Presents run if he would ever even consider writing, Sam Kieth said that he would only ever even think about it if he was co-writing, and that it would have to be with someone that he, quote, implicitly trusted, like Neil Gaiman, Peter David, or William Messner Loebs. There's a host of reasons I don't think Peter David would have worked at Image, and I'm not sure Todd McFarlane would have even let them hire Peter David either way. Neil Gaiman would go on to work with Todd McFarlane quite infamously on an issue of Spawn before long, but there's only a handful of people in the entire industry that even approached the kind of relationship Sam Kieth and William Messner Loebs enjoyed. They'd come up together and they'd help secure work for each other at Comico early on in their careers, and then managed to work together several times following that, progressively throughout their careers, most successfully to that point on the criminally underrated Epicurus the Sage, done for Piranha Press in the 80s, just prior to Sam Kieth really blowing up. While Epicurus was never a huge seller, it did sell out. People actually managed to get their hands on the underprinted and poorly distributed series were instantly captivated by the intelligent storytelling and spellbinding art. On their own, the writing and the art on Epicurus would have been impressive. However, this is certainly a case of the sum being greater than the parts. Epicurus is funny and whimsical while still managing to be intelligent, witty, and engaging all at the same time. The art is obviously drop dead gorgeous, and the story is just as equally captivating. While it hadn't set the world on fire sales-wise, mostly due to Piranha Press and their difficulties as an imprint, in my opinion, Epicurus had gone over well with critics. A lot of people, fans and critics alike, yearned to see Mesner-Loebs and Keith reunite for more work, because I think he felt comfortable with them, as well as the fact that William Mesner-Loebs is an intelligent and well-read guy who Sam Kieth felt could bring a lot to the series, and with Epicurus still fresh in his mind, Sam Kieth knew William Mesner-Loebs was the guy he wanted for dialogue. Given their long relationship, even at the time, Sam Kieth probably also thought it wouldn't be too awfully hard to rope William Mesner-Loebs into doing 8-page stories with him for a 4-issue miniseries where they could basically do whatever they wanted anyway. Sam Kieth might have thought that, but apparently he was dead wrong. The problem was William Mesner-Loebs was busy at the time, and by busy I mean like super busy. He was juggling more than half a dozen series at DC and making a fairly decent wage working on books such as Wonder Woman, Hawkman, The Flash, and about a billion other books. William Mesner-Loebs was so busy he actually turned Sam Kieth down when he approached him about doing Darker Image. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. Sam Kieth kept asking, and William Mesner-Loebs kept telling him he was just working on too much other stuff. After the second time that William Mesner-Loebs turned him down, trying to make it painfully clear he just could not do the series with Sam Kieth at that point, Kieth did finally relent and hire another writer, though I do not know who that writer is. Soon after that, though, William Mesner-Loebs' phone rang. It was Sam Kieth again. He told William Mesner-Loebs the other guy hadn't worked out and subsequently basically pleaded with him once more to do the series. Realizing that, in his words, Sam Kieth wasn't going to quit calling and asking until he said yes, William Mesner-Loebs finally agreed to tackle the dialogue, as well as help Sam Kieth learn the ropes of story writing according to our interview. The Darker Image segments were only going to be 8 pages long, so William Mesner-Loebs and Sam Kieth both thought it wouldn't be that much work, it wouldn't be that difficult to make happen. However, the fate of Darker Image was already in question, and after finally relenting and joining the series, it became evident almost immediately to Mesner-Loebs that the writing on the Max was not going to be like anything else he'd ever worked on. Interestingly, if you see any of the Ashcan editions, which were essentially black and white, mini-sized preview editions of the first image of Darker Image, they have the Homage Studios logo prominently printed on the back. Homage Studios would eventually go on to become Homage Comics, but that wasn't until 1995 with the release of the second volume of Kurt Busiek's mind-blowing Astro City series. At the time of Darker Image, it was only still a handful of guys, though that would quickly change. Today, most people associate Jim Lee with the studio, but Homage actually started off as a small-time operation. Originally, Walt Portacio and Scott Williams were literally inking out of the corner of Williams' condo together and started calling themselves Homage Studios. Portacio and Williams were apparently high school buddies, and while some people like Sam Kieth apparently live for the solitude of just sitting and drawing in a room devoid of anything and everyone else, a lot of other people don't. Walt Portacio and Scott Williams were 2 such individuals and were making a real name for themselves throughout 1985 and 1986 and working under the banner of Homage Studios at the time. A chance encounter on issue 53 of Alpha Flight, however, would quite literally change the course of comics history forever. The story A Blast from the Past was penciled by a then up-and-coming but still basically unknown artist, Jim Lee. When Jim Lee saw the issue, he was super impressed with the inks and how quickly Portacio and Williams were able to produce such high-quality work. After some back and forth, Jim Lee quickly became convinced of the benefits of working as a team with others in order to accomplish more than you ever could on your own. He soon relocated from Berkeley to San Diego to join what by then was officially known as Homage Studios. When Jim Lee joined the ranks, it was decided they had kind of outgrown the condo Williams and Portacio were sharing, and they got an entire apartment. Before long, though, they recruited colorist Joe Chiodo and moved again, this time to a 2-bedroom apartment. It was here things started to take a more definite and defined shape. They even began producing prints of original creations by the time they got the call. It was the call they had been waiting for, and from the moment it came in, they knew it was their time to shine, I think. When Marvel desperately called up Homage in late November 1989, Jim Lee had been doing on-again, off-again work on Uncanny X-Men for almost a year already. While Jim Lee was steadily getting more popular, Marc Silvestri was definitely still the big name on the book. Another longtime jobber, Dan Green, had been contributing inks for most everything, and while Jim Lee had to do several fill-in issues for Silvestri by this point already, something happened. Something bad. I don't know what it was, but the work obviously wasn't ready, nor was it going to be ready, and Marvel was behind the 8-ball. They needed an entire issue of X-Men, namely, I believe, issue 256, inked and ready to go in 14 days. There was nothing. No layouts, no roughs, nothing. Homage Studios played to their strengths, separating the work up as logistically as they could, with Jim Lee handling breakdowns, Portacio rendering, and Williams inks. When they finished the book in 9 days, with 5 days to spare, it became apparent that Homage Studios was a force to be reckoned with. If this wasn't enough, Jim Lee would go on to produce the now immortal cover to issue 268, which is considered one of the best modern covers ever done, in September of 1990, before setting world records for the sale of his groundbreaking work on the adjective-less X-Men only a year after that, in October of 1991. In 1992, after departing from the series, former X-Men acquaintance Marc Silvestri actually joined Homage Studios. Homage once again expanded at this point, but things were getting a lot more serious and profitable by this point, and this time the move was to a real office. Despite the fact that making the move to Homage Studios to join Lee, Portacio, and Williams was done in hopes of kind of rekindling his interest in working in the medium, Marc Silvestri was growing increasingly weary of the constant revisions and constraints that he faced as an artist trying to tell stories in a medium which was quite clearly aimed at juveniles. The move did little to help. It was only when Todd McFarlane ran into him in the lobby of a motel the night before the Image Comics announcement and approached him with the idea of joining Image that he found himself once again excited about the medium. Marc Silvestri, who was already considering leaving the medium entirely anyways, took less than a night before agreeing to join Image. The other Homage Studio members, Jim Lee specifically, were not as easy a sell though. Jim Lee had a family and has always been an intelligent and contemplative man when it comes to his career, quite unprone to rash decisions, especially ones that might have such dire ramifications on his career as leaving Marvel at the height of his popularity. I think the fact that Marc Silvestri, his studio mate and friend, took the plunge helped finally convince the spurious Lee to finally join Image months later. While Marc Silvestri would go on to form the Top Cow imprint a few years later, and Lee would later himself start Wildstorm, which was officially launched in '95 and named after his first 2 Image books, Wildcats and Stormwatch, Homage stayed together as a group for the most part during the move to Image. Before Wildstorm, Jim Lee actually had another company, Aegis Entertainment, as well, which predated both Homage and Wildstorm, though. Aegis was essentially just a holding pen for Lee before he officially got Wildstorm up and going full force about 2 years later, but it was Lee's company. Homage, on the other hand, was still a shared collective banner, a group, especially at this time. Homage was always looking to expand that group if they thought it was profitable, though. While several founding fathers actually held talent searches and original character contests during the first few years of Image, the Homage talent search was different. The Homage talent search's aim was expanding the talent and roster of Homage Studios in order to deal with the growing level of in-house production work they were being faced with and the sheer number of people needed for those tasks given the amount of books they were putting out. Homage were almost immediately interested in growing and producing even more books, and this would require even more people. While Homage Studios wasn't necessarily interested in recruiting new talent to write and draw books on their own, Jim Lee most certainly was. While it's strange for many people to discover, in retrospect it makes a lot of sense that Jim Lee was the one responsible for recruiting the first wave of new talent to work on Image outside of the founding fathers, almost entirely all on his own. He saw the market there and the potential to make money, and I think that's the root of not only Darker Image, but the recruitment of Sam Keith, Larry Stroman, and Dale Keown. He helped get out series that would cement Image's place in the history books and the hearts of fans for generations to come in the process. This is why it's so interesting that Darker Image bears the Homage Studios logo, not Aegis or any other preliminary Wildstorm logo or anything like that. Considering that neither Liefeld or Sam Keith were officially members of Homage, this feels weird, unless of course the Max was supposed to be the first Homage Comics title. I wasn't able to find any direct quotes to back up my assertions here, but considering how quickly Darker Image and the Max accordingly underwent changes, how long it took news to actually see print, and how notoriously tight-lipped both Sam Keith and Jim Lee are about what happens behind the scenes of the stuff they work on like this, it's not a stretch to think that Darker Image was at one point or another at least considered to be the first release under a proposed Homage Studios or Homage Comics imprint or label. Longtime Image alumni Dan Fraga said that Sam Keith's work was done, quote, completely independently of both Rob Liefeld, Jim Lee, and Image itself, for that matter. Sam Keith was never in a collective or a studio or anything at Image, so he definitely wasn't going to be joining the Homage Studios. But the Homage logo is all over the early Darker Image and the early Max stuff. Add to this, from what I've heard, Sam Keith communicated with Image almost entirely through Jim Lee, who had brought him into the fold, and you have a mounting level of evidence that supports this assertion. There's also the rather telling fact that Liefeld had his own studio, Extreme, which never produced a version of the Ashcan. And while I've seen early Max images which display only the Image eye logo, I've never seen anything associated with the Darker Image or Max series which bore the Extreme logo, despite Jim Lee being the one that Sam Keith worked with from most people's recollections and thereby making him his closest working associate at Image. I heard a story that illustrates just how out of place Sam Keith felt and just how much he kept everyone at arm's length at Image. Mike Taylor, an artist who worked on Don Chin's Max parody book, The Tax, later went on to actually work as an intern on an issue of the Max years later. I spoke with Taylor a few times and he shared a telling tale with me at one point. Taylor said that apparently rising star and independent wonderkid Michel Fife had wanted to get permission to run a pinup of the Max in one of his books a few years ago. Naturally, Fife reached out to Image, but it was quickly made clear to him that despite the fact they had published the book and Wildstorm had even been involved with the few reprint collections of the Max ever released, that the project took considerable amounts of effort, due in no small part to the fact no one knew how to get a hold of Sam Keith. Eventually, they contacted Mike Taylor, who, as it turns out, is one of the few people I've gotten the chance to speak with who actually kept up with Sam Keith after the tail end of the 90s. The people who had published his books had no way of getting in touch with him. William Mesner Loebs, who worked with Sam Keith for more than 20 years on and off, had no clue how to contact him, but an intern who had worked on a sum total of one book more than a decade prior had managed to keep in touch. My point is, Sam Keith has always been a guy who enjoys his privacy, and one of the major reasons I personally think he agreed to do the book was that Portacio, Lee, Williams, and Silvestri's studio was going to be overseeing its release. Again, I'm not entirely sure how Rob Liefeld fit into the equation aside from wanting to boost sales, but because Extreme Studios never had an edition of the Darker Image Ashcan like Homage did, I don't believe the book was going to be a joint venture and that Homage was going to handle the release. Given how quickly Rob Liefeld most certainly, and I think probably also Jim Lee, fell behind on deadlines, Darker Image was in very real jeopardy of never even seeing the light of day from day one though. With release dates undergoing seemingly endless changes and books constantly being cancelled and or resolicited, the fate of not only Darker Image but the Max was in a state of seemingly constant flux during the end of 1992 and early 1993. Soon, these uncertainties would bring Sam Keith to a crossroads where he would have to make a fateful decision, a decision that would irrevocably affect his career one way or the other. While it was the initial offer of only 8 pages that I think really cemented the deal for him, this part of the bargain quickly changed, and Sam Keith was left to either adapt or die, as Darker Image and Image Comics itself underwent innumerable and fundamental changes before the first issue ever saw publication. Of all the accusations lobbed at Image, and their somewhat undeserved reputation as troublemakers that was being propagated at the time, there was a major problem that threatened to kill the entire company from almost the moment it started. A lot of their books were late, and not like a week or two late. It got to the point that Diamond Comics distributor, up until recently the be-all, end-all of comics distributors, started threatening and in some cases exercising a lateness clause in their contract that cost some people a lot of money and ended up giving them all a black eye publicly. The thing was, it wasn't everyone at Image. Perhaps the most notorious of these deadline problems revolved around Rob Liefeld, who, for right or wrong, became the poster child for late books during the 1990s. I don't want to get into it here, but if you want to learn more about that, check out my Rob Liefeld Deathmate Incident episode. There's a link in the description, as always, below. Unfortunately, they were all kind of painted with one brush from the beginning, as Jim Valentino pointed out in our recent interview, and as a result, as things continued to get worse, there were strict rules enacted from inside Image which prevented people from soliciting a series before X amount of work was done and monetarily penalized them if they failed to follow through on certain deadlines and benchmarks. This seemed to help later on, but in the early days of Image, it felt like a literal crapshoot if you were going to see the books they announced or not, especially from the guys trying to run entire studios like, say, Jim Lee or Rob Liefeld. I don't know if it was just Rob Liefeld or Liefeld and Lee who had trouble meeting their deadlines for Darker Image, as Lee had a lot of irons in the fire by this point, but I do know that the series, which had initially been planned as a 4-issue miniseries, had gone off the rails within a matter of months. There's bits and pieces of work done for the other proposed issues of Darker Image, but ultimately, only a single issue of the series would ever reach the stands, and even that seems like it took a lot of effort. As it became clear that Darker Image might not happen at all, and if it did, that it was not going to be the proposed 4-issue miniseries it was supposed to be, Sam Keith was left with something of a conundrum on his hands. While he'd initially planned to debut the Max in Darker Image, and if he so choose, spin him off into his own series, by all accounts, the extent of these plans only ever extended to a 3-issue miniseries with a proposed Wizard Magazine 1/2 mini-comic to accompany it. While Sam Keith claimed he longed to work on interiors for Marvel, according to interviews, looking back it seems like he kind of avoided ongoing titles following his run-in with Karen Berger on Sandman to me. I got into that in the first episode, so if you don't know what I'm talking about, make sure to check that out when you're done here. Faced with a series of impossible decisions, Sam Keith had to think quickly on his feet, and as a result, the series underwent several radical shifts in only a matter of months. Jim Lee came out of the gate swinging for the fences and was probably pushing the idea of an ongoing title as opposed to a miniseries or anything like that from the beginning to Sam Keith. Sam Keith has also said that people had told him at the time no one would ever remember him if he just kept doing 8-page stories. He was going to have to do full issues. With Jim Lee's suggestions most likely, as well as the promises that an ongoing title as opposed to a miniseries held, what came next almost seems like an inevitability looking back, despite how much I think it went against Sam Keith's nature to that point. At some point, I think Sam Keith began to understand this was probably his big chance. He either stood up and decided to swing for the fences himself, or he gave in to peer pressure. I'm not entirely sure which. Regardless of his reasoning for doing so, Sam Keith made the call to not only take the Max from the pages of Darker Image and indeed spin him off before the anthology ever hit the stands, but also that the Max's titular series wouldn't just be a mini-series either, but an ongoing monthly series. Regardless of how he got roped into a monthly title, because the fate of Darker Image was unclear, no one really knew if that first issue was going to come out. But one thing was for sure, though, it wasn't going to make it out on time. Because the publication date of Darker Image was in perpetual limbo and kept shifting, Sam Keith couldn't rely on the story in it, which was supposed to be the introduction to the Max. He would instead have to do an entirely new story, one that introduced the character, but one that also didn't directly repeat anything from Darker Image, so people weren't buying or reading 2 copies of the same thing in case the story ever did see print. As I mentioned early on, when Sam Keith had considered the possibility of giving the Max his own series, provided he was both popular enough and Sam Keith actually wanted to do it, that concept was only envisioned as a 3-issue miniseries with a small Wizard tie-in 1/2 issue. This gave Sam Keith a definitive in and out on the Max, and I think would have been a much more comfortable decision for him. It would have also mirrored Erik Larsen's approach, who had chosen to only introduce the Savage Dragon as a 3-issue miniseries before taking some time off to get ahead of work on the ongoing monthly book, so he didn't fall behind schedule or bite off more than he could chew. While this would have probably allowed Sam Keith a lot more of the time he later regretted not having going into the Max, there were certain forces at work, the power of which I think are kind of undeniable. Namely, money. While Darker Image was seriously behind schedule, it was still being touted for release. And in Wizard Magazine 20, where Sam Keith gave his first real interview that I know of, officially announcing that the Max would be appearing outside of the pages of Darker Image, although still saying it was going to be a miniseries, what's more pertinent here is the fact he reveals that there's already a Topps card series in the works. With all of the crazy behind-the-scenes stuff that was going on, despite the fact the character was supposed to premiere in a book that had never actually come out, regardless of this, the Max was getting a card set before he even had a single issue or appearance published. What makes this whole thing all the more crazy is that Wizard 20 didn't come out until April of 1993. The original ongoing Max title from Image we all know and love had actually been released in the first week of March, which had then been followed by the long-delayed Darker Image 1 several weeks later, just prior to Wizard 20 hitting the stands in May. With a card set already secured and more offers than he knew what to do with, it seems that Sam Keith was probably lured in by the potential rewards offered by an ongoing series like merchandise and licensing, as opposed to the comparatively limited opportunities of a miniseries, which is a much harder sale to pitch people on. While I don't know this is the case, looking at this objectively, it's not hard to infer this is at least one of the major factors that hasten the Max's quick transition from a mini to an ongoing monthly title so quickly, given Sam Keith's previous problems with ongoing monthly titles in the past. What's perhaps most interesting to me here is that Sam Keith was obsessed with hitting his deadlines and getting the book out on time, and he was good at it, at least at first. Case in point, he was so driven to get the title done and out on time, the first issue of the Max hit stands weeks before Darker Image ever did. This means something very important in my opinion. The first issue of the series was most people's introduction to the character, not Darker Image. I know that was the case for myself. This is important because when talking about precisely why he feels like the Max could have succeeded no matter what he did, Sam Keith always points out that it's because he was next to Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld and their original creations during the heyday of the Speculators boom. In this narrative, Sam Keith conveniently neglects to account for the delayed release of Darker Image, or very likely he chooses to ignore it, believing in spite of this fact that Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld are somehow still responsible for the success of the Max. While I have no doubt that there were plenty of people who came over as readers initially to the Max from Darker Image, if you were super into Rob Liefeld comics, Sam Keith was probably going to lose you fast. Same with Jim Lee, most likely. Sam Keith has made and continues to make numerous references to the fact people who read his books are, quote, weird like he is, and we're going to get it and read the book anyways. But if people were only interested in speculating on the first issue or just came over from Darker Image and then quit reading the series, then the Max would not have gone on to last 35 issues spanning more than 5 years, produce a 3-issue spin-off, several specials, numerous crossover appearances, an audio and an animated adaptation, and manage to cultivate one of the most loyal and long-lasting fan bases of any 90s franchise I'm aware of. If these long-time, die-hard Max heads or weird people were going to get his stuff anyways, and they were the only reason this book lasted, I'm not entirely sure how Sam Keith legitimizes his belief that his success was due solely to Rob Liefeld and Jim Lee's popularity. There's no doubt they played a pivotal role, just as Darker Image and his general association with Image did, but The Max was and continues to be successful on its own merits for its own reasons, completely apart from the legacy or spotlight of anyone besides Sam Kieth, in my opinion. The art is absolutely the thing that draws you in with the Max 90% of the time, but the story is what makes you stay, especially in those early issues. There's something magical happening between Sam Kieth, Jim Sinclair, and William Messner Loebs. There's an almost perfect marriage of words and art going on that's kind of evocative of Twin Peaks in a lot of ways. While there is a lot of the story that's open to interpretation and that kind of thing, there's also a very definite series of events that are taking place. While most certainly strange, the Max never felt labored or confusing for the sake of doing so, in my opinion. This is because of not only the amazing chemistry, but I'm sure ability to work with each other that Sam Kieth and William Messner Loebs had developed over their years of friendship and working together. This is evidenced by the extraordinarily interesting fashion in which the Max was written, apparently. As most of the finer details, like how many pages the book would be, when it was going to come out, and even whether it was going to be a miniseries or an ongoing title, were up in the air as the fate of Darker Image was decided, the Max required some radically different thinking, due in no small part to all the behind-the-scenes theatrics the public wasn't privy to, as well as the story itself, and Sam Kieth and William Messner Loeb's nearly 20-year-long working relationship at this point. The writing on the Max was unlike any other book I've ever read about in a few ways. In some ways, its creation isn't entirely unlike a story crafted using what's commonly referred to today as the Marvel method, wherein the writer and artist have a short discussion about a story, the artist goes off and draws it, and then the writer puts the final touches on the script and dialogue once the story is complete around that art. With the Marvel method, though, one of the main reasons that it was utilized to begin with was saving time. The discussions between writer and artists about stories would be short, to put it mildly, in most cases. In the case of the Max, though, there were hours-long, endlessly protracted conversations about the story between William Messner Loebs and Sam Kieth that took place weekly. As a result, William Messner Loebs, despite being credited merely with dialogue, played an important role in the development of the story and the plot of the Max during the entirety of his time on the book. Sam Kieth apparently wasn't so much worried he wouldn't be able to come up with the story as he was that he might not be able to effectively pace it. Sam Kieth knew his dialogue would be clunky without help, and that's the main reason he brought William Messner Loebs on board. But from the very beginning, it was also William Messner Loebs' job to kind of take the story that they had discussed and help tie story elements and plot threads together to make an entertaining read. According to Sam Kieth, quote, "I've never plotted before. That's what's going to be interesting. I've broken down stories in typical Marvel method in which the artist lays out the full comic book from a 2 or 3 page plot. So I don't feel that coming up with the sequence of events is that different. I just have to try to convey to build the characterizations and as many motivations as possible. My part will be what goes on, and his part will be to have them say the things gracefully and not awkwardly, which would be what would happen if I tried to script it." And while this was a great deal of what William Messner Loebs did, to say that the writing was a symbiotic process would be to put it lightly, in my opinion. Unlike the Marvel method, where the discussion about any given story was short and sweet to say the least, the point was to save time after all, but Sam Kieth and William Messner Loebs would have hours-long, unending discussions about what was going to happen in the Max, philosophy, and everything in between. This is because although he was initially hired on and credited only for dialogue, even according to Sam Kieth, William Messner Loebs was an important part of the Max from the moment it started. Quote, "Basically his job was to try to make sense out of whatever I drew and plotted. Essentially, I just wanted somebody there to add some logic to it and weave it together." According to my interview with William Messner Loebs, the way this was achieved was Sam Kieth would call William Messner Loebs and then just kind of explode ideas and concepts at him over the phone. The larger part of his job didn't so much have to do with what came out of people's mouths, but in helping Sam Kieth figure out what they would even be talking about from month to month, especially on the early issues. William Messner Loebs would take these ideas and concepts, cut them down to manageable chunks, reassemble them in an entirely new fashion, then feed them back to Sam Kieth as the story for a single issue. He would then later weave them together with the other issues to create a cohesive arc that tied the books together as a series. Basically, William Messner Loebs would pick out whatever he thought might actually fit into a single issue during these weekly conversations. He would trim the stuff that didn't work or didn't fit, and then figure out how they could tie it together into a story of some sort with Sam Kieth. This was all while also remembering the other stuff that Kieth had come up with they hadn't utilized for possible later use. The rather strange nature of the Max aside, this is actually a really great way for a series and a story to evolve, in my opinion, but there was one small problem. It didn't really seem like Sam Kieth necessarily always knew where he was going or even where he wanted to go with the Max. William Messner Loebs came up working on traditional superhero comic books. He wanted the secret identity, the origin, the hook. He went into the Max with what seems to be a much more traditional superhero in mind, whereas I don't think that was ever even something that crossed Sam Kieth's mind. Neither did pesky details like who the Max really was or where he came from, which, strangely enough, might be all the things one would assume to be essential building blocks for a proposed monthly series. While they had endless conversations about nearly every facet of the book and story from the very start, when it came to discussing any real specifics about the character of the Max, his origins, or even which world was real, according to my interview with William Messner Loebs, Sam Kieth was aggravatingly aloof. He continually avoided anything that might tie him to anything specific, and after a while, I get the feeling William Messner Loebs was just getting a little bit annoyed. This was a guy who was used to working from a plot and went into stuff with a game plan. You had to when you were working with properties like Superman, who showed up in a dozen titles a month for one of the world's largest comic book publishers. The Max was a horse of another color, though. Sam Kieth has described the writing process as, quote, pulling monkeys out of his ass, and this doesn't appear to be far off from the mark for my discussions with William Messner Loebs either. Again, I don't think this evasiveness was so much about actually stringing William Messner Loebs or readers along as it was Sam Kieth really not having the time to work out the story and the details beforehand. He knew the rough concepts and the ideas he wanted to explore, but even between the Darker Image story introducing him and the first issue, the Max character and his world were undergoing radical changes routinely. While they would talk for hours each week, and Sam Kieth would suggest that William Messner Loebs read books about the Aboriginal concept of the dreaming and other philosophical works to better understand the story and the concepts he was playing at, when it came to telling the guy who was scripting and helping write the book who the Max actually was, Kieth was painfully tight-lipped. Eventually, William Messner Loebs, who was beginning to try and really tie things together in a meaningful way a few issues into the series, kind of demanded information from Sam Kieth, saying at one point, you can con the reader, you can con the publisher, but you can't con your writer. I believe this was right around the third or fourth issue, and you can almost sense when this conversation finally took place. It's at this point the writing and story are really taking shape and becoming finished ideas rather than loose concepts, not only for Sam Kieth and William Messner Loebs, but for readers as well. While the Max is undeniably a creation of Sam Kieth's unique mind, it was the incredible collaboration between Sam Kieth and William Messner Loebs, which itself was in large part due to the rushed nature of the book that ironically resulted in the absolutely spellbinding tales which would go on to encompass what I refer to as the first volume of the book, comprised of the first 20 issues or so. This section of the series concerns itself with a much more traditional concept of storytelling, presentation of the characters, and even a linear plot, as a lot of people would envision. The second half of the series, while not perhaps his favorite work, was for better or worse the product of Sam Kieth on his own without this other half. And you can tell from the moment that it starts. While again, the Max is totally a creation of the insanity that is Sam Kieth, and there's no arguing otherwise to me, the true genius, the real success of the Max doesn't lie in who came up with it. It lies in the combined performance of everyone involved. As much as Jim Sinclair is responsible for so many things people associate with the series, so is William Messner Loebs. His approach to the book being that of a superhero and Sam Keith being a much less defined and more nebulous idea to begin with is what resulted in the true majesty of the first half of the series. While it felt an obvious shame and an undeniable loss for the series when he left, William Messner Loeb's departure from the series was far from impetuous like one might be inclined to believe for a few reasons. Strangely enough, William Messner Loeb's planned from the beginning to leave the series at some point once Sam Keith felt like he had learned the ropes enough to, in his words, quote, sabotage it himself. I think this fact led Sam Keith to be much more inquisitive during their conversations having to do with the story and the characters, which easily transcended a lot of traditional writing methods, especially ones that you see implemented in most mainstream books like the Marvel Method. Because Sam Keith was basically trying to learn how to do William Messner Loeb's job, this probably led to some fairly unique and interesting interactions, especially early on in the series. It certainly meant that William Messner Loeb's suggestions would hold a lot more weight than they perhaps would have in other situations where he was simply handling writing or even just working with someone who was more accustomed to writing a comic book in general. In fact, I think there's a few things that you can point to just how large of a role William Messner Loeb played along with Sam Keith in helping create the world of the Maxx, so to speak. It might be hard to see looking back at this point, but one of William Messner Loeb's biggest contributions to the series actually came in the form of the 1993 Topps trading card set. Comprised of 90 unique and original images at the time, the Topps set was touted as not just being a must-own because of the exclusive art, but the flavored text on the back of the cards as well. According to solicitations for the Topps set, if you read the backs of the cards, you would actually get hints about the series as well as secret reveals that wouldn't be in the pages of the book for some time. It was a tall order, and obviously the card set was meant to expand not just the merchandising reach of the Maxx, but add something to the world and set the series apart in that regard as well. It was a great idea, but the thing was, Sam Keith wasn't entirely sure what those secrets were. At the time the card set was announced, the world of the Maxx was far from defined enough for Sam Keith to write 90 cards worth of meaningful information about the series. So he let William Messner Loeb handle it instead. Because William Messner Loeb was constantly asking about the Maxx and the worlds that he inhabited, Sam Keith decided to let William Messner Loeb actually help lay out a lot of the foundation and the building blocks that the series would expand on for the rest of its run. While not everything on these cards came into play during the series, and not everything is the same, this openness from Sam Keith to allow William Messner Loeb free reign to help create and define the world of the Maxx hints at a broad and expansive level of communication between the two creators. Simply credited with, quote, swell dialogue for anyone who read the series, especially after William Messner Loeb departed the series after 20-some issues, I think it's obvious his part was considerably larger than all of that. On top of the writing, there was another rather interesting peculiarity to the Maxx, for which it seems William Messner Loeb was again uniquely qualified. Whenever Sam Keith was pressed about the subject of writing or creating original characters, he would always suggest the same idea. Somehow, he would take everything that he'd ever worked on up until that point and combine it into one vehicle. Every story and every character that Sam Keith had ever done would be a part of this big overarching universe that reached back to his very first professionally published work in the pages of Comico's Primer number 5. If you're sitting there thinking this sounds kind of insane, that's probably because it is. Just because it's insane doesn't mean that Sam Keith didn't do it, though. In case you're unfamiliar, the name of Sam Keith's first professionally published work done in 1984 for Comico's Primer number 5 is Max the Hare. Mind you, there's only one X, but Sam Keith has made it undeniably clear that he feels the Max's first appearance is in Primer number 5. He plainly stated that fact in the ad for issue 2 of his Fantagraphics series IB4E, which reprinted Max the Hare, before then going on to actually put it on the cover of the second printing of the same book after the Maxx subsequently started to blow up. And if you're sitting there scratching your head because you don't get the significance of the title alone, spoiler alert for a 30-year-old book, but it turns out that the first Maxx, Dave, the homeless guy running around in purple spandex that everyone thinks of when they think of the Maxx, is actually a homeless guy and a rabbit combined underneath his mask, which is actually a lampshade. Sam Keith was obviously calling ideas and concepts that he'd had around for a while, and in some cases, like that of the Izzes, he'd been refining for the better part of a decade in other publications that predated the Max. The Izzes show up numerous times in his earlier publications, namely 2 issues of Critters from Fantagraphics, one of which features an absolutely gorgeous cover of what's clearly a flesh-colored Izz, as well as Amazing Comics Premieres number 4. While this was done in part because Sam Keith didn't necessarily have all the time in the world to come up with completely original characters for the universe of the Max, let alone 2 of them, Sam Keith had also expressed the fact that this was something he was interested in doing before the Max ever launched, interestingly. So while the squeeze might have been on time-wise, Sam Keith had likely already planned on pulling from previous publications, making it a simpler prospect and much more manageable in a lot of ways. While it would undergo numerous changes following the Maxverse, as it was sometimes referred to over the years, as characters continue to weave their way in and out of other titles and books that Sam Keith has done, this collective universe is now earned its own official name, the Troutaverse. As far as I understand, the Max was the first true beginnings of the Troutaverse. This idea of all things and places crossing and interacting, playing and bouncing off of each other, unified by a singular character or a centralized universe you were looking at things through the lens of. Don't ask me to explain it any further than that, though. Even I don't fully get it, I don't think. The universe is comprised of loosely affiliated characters and stories, essentially all tied together by the appearance of this unaging, magical talking trout that keeps popping up, I think. The trout itself, I believe, came later. I don't have any recollection of his showing up in the Max, but Sam Keith would often reinforce the fact that all of these stories he did technically happen in the same universe, even during the period when he felt like he couldn't really stand to think about the Max following the series abruptly coming to an end with the 35th issue. Perhaps the most famous of these nods to other books is when one of the main characters from Zero Girl, which was coincidentally done for Jim Lee's Homage Comics imprint, references having bought his car, the iconic VW Bug from the Max, from none other than Julie Winters herself. It's a passing thing, most people would blink and miss it, but for people who haven't read his earlier work, there are little things like this that constantly confuse you, as you would obviously have no clue who they were even referring to. While character designs and a few other motifs were already beginning to repeatedly show up in his work, with the Max, this idea of a continuous, collective universe inhabited by his creations really started to take shape. During his run on the Max, it became a creative, artistic choice, not something done because he was late on deadlines or didn't feel like coming up with another kooky monster for the Outback this month. While this did probably initially helped to provide Sam Keith with some of the necessary elements and ideas he was so desperately in need of in the form of character designs and that kind of thing, more importantly, it also probably played a very large role in the themes of duality as well as the interpretive storytelling elements that were such an integral part of the Max as a lasting piece of successful fiction, in my opinion. While all of this most likely stems from the fact that Sam Keith didn't necessarily have a game plan going into the series, at least not the way he would have liked anyways, interestingly, while reading the Max, this malleable and shifting quality is one of the series' greatest strengths, and yet ultimately would also prove its greatest weakness as well. The story could stop and pivot on a moment's notice, or no notice at all. The story could shift characters entirely. The tone could completely change. The art could appear to have been done by a child, or approach abstract minimalism or surrealism at points. None of it felt weird. None of it felt strange or out of place. While some people might not agree, to me, the Max always felt like an episode of Twin Peaks. Anything and everything was possible, and it could mean the exact opposite of what you're actually seeing with your eyes. This kind of storytelling has always interested me when it's done right, and the Max was perhaps the best I've ever read at doing just that in comic book form. But when teamed with Sam Keith's obvious waning interest in superhero comic books and a growing need to tell much deeper, more personal stories, you have the ingredients for a time bomb that would eventually blow the series apart. Thanks so much for sticking with me. I know this has been a long time coming. I have a few other Sam Keith related videos, but I thought I owed it to you all to finally get this done. I hope it was worth the wait and you enjoyed, maybe even learned something. If you did enjoy what you saw, think about getting in the comments section below and letting me know. Share these videos with your friends. If you really enjoyed what you saw, make sure you Hulk smash that subscribe button. If you do that, make sure you ding the little notification bell so you never miss another video or premiere again. If you feel like you're in a position to help the channel grow, think about using the links in the description below to sign up for my Patreon page. For as little as $3 a month, you get access to tons of behind the scenes posts, exclusive content like uncut interviews, and you can even get your name in the credits. If Patreon is not your thing, but you still want to support the channel, have no fear. After 2 years, I can finally offer memberships right here on YouTube. Just click the little join button and make sure you select the tier and perks that fit you best. You can also make one-time donations towards specific goals or just tip the channel using the Ko-Fi link in the description below as well. If that's not enough, you can even pick up your very own Jerk comic shirts like the ones you see on the screen now. This video was made possible by the Jerk broadcasting service as well as generous grants from the Patreon, Ko-Fi, and YouTube members you see on the screen now. I'd like to seriously thank every single one of you who has chosen to support the channel this year. I think the quality of the videos has really been improving, and I just hope I'm doing you all proud. Thank you to every single one of you that chooses to support this channel. I couldn't do these videos without your help, and it means the world to me, and I have some big plans for this upcoming year, so keep an eye on the channel, and thank you again from the bottom of my heart. I hope this series has been worth the wait. This has been the channel that the Max and Image built, so thank you all for sticking with me. I hope you all enjoyed, maybe even learned something, and as always, I really, truly, and honestly ask only two things. Keep hitting those local shops, and keep reading comics.